It wasn't the first time I questioned why we were out here, pushing the edges of the galaxy, mapping uncharted systems like cartographers of an endless sea. Space exploration had changed. Gone were the days when we dreamed of meeting alien civilizations and shaking hands with beings from other worlds. We'd long since realized that the universe didn't care for our dreams. It was cold, indifferent, and vast. The few missions we had made into the unknown had revealed nothing but barren planets and lifeless moons. Where was the promise of the stars? The hope of discovering other minds? The cosmos had become a wasteland, and I felt like we were just drifting through it. Seems like a lot already, doesn't it? But this was only the start. As humanity's gaze had expanded outward, it hadn't found the answers we were hoping for. Our greatest hopes of discovery had turned into routine. Every mission felt the same. Another survey, another barren rock, another system devoid of life. But sometimes, just sometimes, the universe had a way of throwing you a curveball. And this time, I was about to feel that firsthand. I was staring at the endless blackness of space from my captain's chair, lost in thought, when Lieutenant Carter Vale's voice suddenly cut through the silence. "Captain," she said, her voice sharp, but not in the usual way. There was something else behind it. "You're going to want to see this." I raised an eyebrow, pushing myself upright in my chair. "What is it, Vale?" Her fingers danced over the controls as she pulled up a series of scans on the holoscreen. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing as I looked at the planet that appeared before me. It wasn't anything extraordinary at first glance. A distant, pale blue world, not unlike Earth, but something felt off. You'd think that would be enough, wouldn't you? But things only got more intense. The scans weren't revealing anything too unusual, at least nothing that screamed danger. The atmosphere seemed breathable, the size and gravity similar to our own planet. But something in my gut told me this wasn't a normal discovery. "This is strange," Vale muttered as she zoomed in on the planet's surface. She pulled up more detailed scans. That's when I saw it, the biosphere. There were life forms on this planet, but they weren't like anything we'd encountered in the thousands of systems we'd cataloged. As I stared at the images of forests, oceans, and mountains, I began to feel a growing unease in the pit of my stomach. They looked too familiar, too much like Earth. Yet there was something wrong with them. I leaned closer to the screen. The trees were not just trees. They had thick, twisted trunks, their bark blackened and warped, as though burned by something unnatural. The oceans appeared like liquid glass, with strange, glowing patterns swirling beneath the surface. And the land animals, large, lumbering beasts with too many limbs, insect-like creatures with multiple eyes and others with jaws that seemed unnaturally wide. My heart began to race. You know, sometimes you think you've seen it all, but you haven't. I couldn't explain why, but the world felt off-kilter. I glanced at Vale. "What's going on here? The scans show life, but it doesn't look right." Vale's voice was barely above a whisper when she answered. "It's like a twin Earth, but it's different. Evolution here. Captain, it's not what we expected." I turned back to the screen, my pulse quickening as I took in the planet's surface. It was like Earth, yes, but twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. The life forms here didn't just seem alien. They felt like distortions, like echoes of Earth's natural world, but warped, as if evolution had taken a wrong turn somewhere. "Rook," I called, not taking my eyes off the screen. "Get over here." Rook was our ship's lead scientist, the one person who could make sense of things when we were out in the unknown. She stepped toward the control console, her eyes scanning the data, her lips pressing into a thin line. "What do you think?" I asked, trying to keep the panic from my voice. Rook was silent for a long moment, her eyes darting from one readout to another, absorbing the information like a sponge. Then she exhaled slowly, her face pale. "Captain," she said, her voice quiet but laced with something like fear. "I don't know what we're looking at here, but I think this isn't just a twin Earth. Something has gone horribly wrong with evolution here." I blinked. "What do you mean? What could cause something like this?" Rook took a deep breath. "Look at these scans. The planet's ecosystem, there's something about it. It's not just different, it's unnatural. These creatures, she paused, shaking her head. They're evolving in ways that defy everything we know about biology. They're mutating, adapting faster than any natural process should allow. The hairs on my neck stood on end. What kind of mutations? What are we dealing with? She turned back to the screen, bringing up a new set of images. I saw creatures moving through the thick forests, large insectoid things with multiple eyes, some even with humanoid features. Their bodies stretched too thin, elongated limbs scuttling across the ground like something out of a nightmare. There's no way this is normal. No animal on Earth could ever evolve like this, Rook continued. These creatures, they're intelligent, and they're aware. More than that, I think they're evolving deliberately, as if something is pushing them to do this. Something is controlling it. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I glanced back at Vale, who was now staring at the screen, her expression unreadable. "We need to get closer," she said. "We have to land. We need to see it up close." I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong, like we were trespassing on something we had no business understanding. But the scientist in me knew we had to investigate. If there was even the faintest possibility that this was a unique discovery, a world where evolution had gone awry, we had to learn more. "Set a course for the planet," I ordered, finally breaking the silence. "Get us as close as you can without engaging the atmosphere yet." Vale nodded and adjusted the ship's trajectory. The hum of the engines deepened as we changed course, and the ship slowly began to drift toward the twin Earth, its surface growing larger and more vivid on the view screen. I stood up and walked toward the observation window. The planet below us was beautiful, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. The more I looked, the more I felt like it was staring back at me. A quiet, unspoken warning. It was a mirror of Earth, but something had gone terribly wrong. "What happened here?" I muttered under my breath. "What could have caused this?" As if in response, the ship's sensors beeped, drawing my attention to the console. "Captain," Rook said, her voice trembling, "you need to see this." I turned, my heart racing, as I walked back to the console. She zoomed in on a specific part of the planet's surface. There, in the heart of a vast, sprawling jungle, was something that shouldn't have existed. A building. No, not just any building. Something huge. Towers that stretched upward into the sky, their jagged, crumbling edges forming shapes that I couldn't quite place. And then, for a fleeting moment, I saw movement in the shadows. Figures, humanoid shapes, but not human. They were watching us. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "Vale," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "we need to land. Now." But deep down, I knew something was wrong. We were about to uncover something so horrific, so unnatural, that it might change everything we knew about the universe. Yeah, I had a feeling this wasn't going to be the fun discovery kind of mission. But the question I couldn't shake was, would we survive to understand it? The ship descended slowly toward the surface, the cold glow of the twin Earth growing larger with each passing second. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us. A sense of wrongness had settled over me, and it only deepened as we drew closer to the planet. There was no denying it now. This world, this mirror of Earth, wasn't just another discovery, it was an abomination. Seriously, who thought this was a good idea? I stared out the observation window, my eyes fixed on the vast expanse below. The planet looked beautiful from a distance. Lush jungles, sprawling oceans, towering mountain ranges. But something in the air, something in the way the light reflected off the land, made it feel alive. It was as though the planet itself was conscious, aware of our presence, and perhaps even waiting for us. "We're approaching the landing zone, Captain." Vale's voice broke through my thoughts, but her tone was strained, like she was fighting the same gnawing anxiety that I was. "Understood," I replied, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "Rook, what are we dealing with? Any more data on the life forms?" Rook's face was pale, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was tapping away at her console, eyes darting back and forth between multiple screens. "I'm not sure, Captain. The creatures, they're unlike anything we've encountered. Some of them appear to have biological traits that shouldn't even exist. We're seeing organisms with human-like intelligence in a way that doesn't make sense. They're evolving too fast. I can't keep up with the data. I felt a chill at the back of my neck. Human-like intelligence? On a planet that was supposed to be a mirror of Earth? That was disturbing, to say the least. Are they hostile? I asked, my eyes never leaving the planet. I'm not sure, Rook said, her voice trembling. The scans are too inconsistent. There's something about their biology that doesn't fit any classification. But I can tell you this much. Whatever is on that planet, it's not natural. Something is driving this, Captain. Something we don't understand. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Keep me posted. Vale, go ahead with the landing. Let's see what we're dealing with. The ship's engines hummed as the atmosphere grew thicker, and the ship's descent became more pronounced. The towering skeletal trees below us grew larger, their twisted forms casting long, dark shadows on the land. The jungle stretched for miles, an endless sea of gnarled branches and strange foliage. The land was alive, but not in any way I'd ever seen before. Everything here seemed unnatural, as though the laws of nature had been twisted and warped beyond recognition. I couldn't look away from the images on the screen. The creatures moving through the jungle were like something out of a nightmare. They moved in ways that didn't seem possible, on legs too long, with too many joints, or arms that stretched out unnaturally. Some of them were vaguely humanoid, but with grotesque, elongated features, and eyes that seemed to pierce right through the hull of our ship. Yeah, no thanks. Definitely not the kind of thing I'd want to run into in a dark alley. We're nearing the surface, Vale said, her voice tight with apprehension. I'm going to land us in the clearing ahead. Stay sharp, everyone. As the ship touched down, the sudden jolt of impact sent a shiver down my spine. I felt the weight of what we were about to do settle heavily on my shoulders. We were about to set foot on a world that wasn't just alien, it was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. Everyone, suit up! Get your gear together, I commanded. We're going in. Rook was the first to stand, her face pale but resolute. We're going to need more than just basic gear, Captain. Whatever's happening here, it's more than we can handle with just our usual equipment. I glanced at her, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. She was right. This wasn't just a routine survey mission. This was something more. This was an encounter with something we didn't understand. Something that could be dangerous, even deadly. All right, Rook, suit up with everything you can. We don't know what's waiting for us down there. As the crew prepared for the expedition, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. A prickle of unease crept up my spine, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the shadows. But the clearing outside was empty, still, quiet, and eerily calm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we were ready. I grabbed my helmet, strapping it on tightly as I led the team out of the ship and onto the surface of this twisted twin Earth. The air was thick and heavy, humid, but with a strange metallic undertone. I felt the ground beneath my boots vibrate slightly as we stepped onto the alien soil. The forest around us was silent, but I could feel something. Presence. It was as if the jungle itself was aware of our arrival, waiting for us to make the next move. I gestured for the team to spread out, my eyes scanning the trees. The towering skeletal trees seemed to pulse with some unseen energy, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like fingers of some monstrous entity. Keep your eyes open, I warned. This place is not what it seems. We moved cautiously, the rustling of leaves the only sound in the otherwise suffocating silence. It was almost as though the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. Yeah, you ever get the feeling that the planet's just waiting for you to screw up? Because that's how this feels. Then suddenly we heard it, a distant, eerie howl. It echoed through the jungle like the cry of some unearthly beast. It was a sound that sent a chill through my bones, a primal fear that crawled up my spine. The sound was distant but unmistakable. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just aware of us. It was tracking us. We're not alone, Vale whispered, her voice tight with fear. What the hell is that? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. This planet wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a nightmare waiting to unfold. We pressed on, the air growing thicker as we ventured deeper into the jungle. The strange creatures we'd seen on the scans earlier, those distorted, mutated life forms, were everywhere. Some of them moved on all fours, their long, sinewy bodies gliding through the underbrush like snakes. Others stood upright, watching us with unnerving intelligence in their eyes. Their gaze followed us wherever we went, and I could feel their presence pressing in on me, suffocating. "Captain," Rook called out from the front, "I think I found something." I rushed toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. Rook was kneeling on the ground studying something closely. At first I thought it was just another twisted plant or strange organism, but as I looked closer I realized what she was holding in her gloved hand. It was a bone, but it wasn't just any bone. It was too big. It was human, or at least humanoid in shape, but it had been warped, twisted and deformed in ways I couldn't comprehend. The bone was cracked, its surface charred, as though it had been exposed to some kind of extreme heat. I took a step back, my stomach turning. "What is this?" Rook didn't look up, her eyes fixed on the object. This doesn't belong here. This bone, whatever it came from, it's part of something much bigger. Something that didn't just evolve here. It's a mutation, a result of something unnatural. Yeah, we're way over our heads here. A low growl erupted from somewhere deep within the jungle, and I spun around. The creatures were getting closer. I could hear the rustling of branches, the cracking of twigs underfoot, and then through the trees, I saw them. Figures, humanoid shapes, but not human. They were tall, too tall, and their limbs were too long, too thin. Their eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and their skin was stretched tight over their bones, almost translucent in the dim light. They were watching us, their expressions unreadable, but there was a clear intensity in their gaze. I raised my hand to signal for the crew to fall back, but before I could react, one of the creatures took a step forward, its elongated hand outstretched, fingers twitching with an almost deliberate slowness. And then, in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The moment the creature spoke, time seemed to slow down. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was a rasping whisper, its sound like dry leaves scraping against one another, coming from somewhere deep in the throat of the humanoid figure. It wasn't a language we recognize. It wasn't even human. It was otherworldly. And the fact that it could speak, that was what chilled me to my core. The creature's yellow eyes burned into mine with an unsettling intensity. Its skin was a pale, translucent white, stretched thin across its bones, and its limbs were impossibly long. Unnaturally so, like a spider's. It stood several feet taller than any human, and yet it moved with an eerie grace, its long, spindly fingers twitching in the air, as if they were gauging the distance between us. The creature tilted its head, almost as if it were examining us, deciding whether we were worth its attention. And in that moment, I realized something. The creature wasn't just watching us, it was waiting for us to make our move. I held up my hand, signaling for the crew to stay back. "Everyone, hold your position," I ordered, my voice steady, though every muscle in my body was screaming to run. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, an unshakable feeling of wrongness crawling down my spine. The creature didn't move, didn't speak again. It just stood there, its eyes flicking from one of us to the next, as though cataloging our every action, our every breath. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it stepped backward, disappearing into the dense jungle with a fluidity that defied logic. There was no rustle of leaves, no noise to signal its departure. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed up by the shadows of the alien world. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were our own breathing and the distant eerie howls that echoed through the jungle. There was something primal about that sound, something that unsettled me at a level I couldn't explain. "What was that?" Lieutenant Vale whispered, her voice tight with fear, her hand still hovering near her weapon. "I don't know," I replied, my own voice hoarse, but it wasn't alone. Rook was the first to break the silence. That wasn't natural. It's not just a mutated creature. I don't know how to explain it, but that thing had intelligence, awareness. And those eyes, they were human, but not. They were wrong. I could feel the knot in my stomach tighten. The unsettling feeling I had tried to ignore was now undeniable. Whatever was on this planet, it wasn't just some random mutation. It wasn't a freak accident of evolution. It was something deliberate, something that had been manipulated, and worse, it was watching us. And that was the scariest part. "We need to move," I said, my voice low but firm. "We've got to find shelter. We don't know what else is out here, but I'm willing to bet that wasn't the last of them." The crew nodded in agreement, the fear now palpable in the air. We began to move again, cautiously, our every step careful and calculated. The dense jungle loomed around us, the twisted trees casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. It felt like we were being followed, not just by the creatures we had already seen, but by the planet itself, as though the very land was aware of our presence. The ground was soft beneath our boots, and the air was thick with the scent of rot and decay. It was oppressive, heavy, as if the jungle itself was choking on something. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made us jump, our weapons held tightly, our eyes darting around at every sound. "I've found something," Rook said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. She had stopped in front of a set of massive weathered structures, what could only be described as ruins. The architecture was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Twisted, jagged, almost organic in nature, as if the very buildings themselves had grown out of the earth, as though they were part of the landscape. The stones were cracked and scorched, their surfaces blackened and charred, with strange symbols etched into them. "Is this a city?" Vale asked, stepping forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the ruins. Rook was already moving toward the center of the ruins, her hand tracing the strange symbols. "I don't think it's a city. I think it's something more. These ruins, they're old, older than anything we've seen. And the burn marks, these aren't just natural weathering. Whatever happened here, it wasn't just a natural disaster. This place was scorched on purpose." I felt a chill. "Scorched on purpose? By who?" Rook didn't answer immediately. She was too busy inspecting the symbols, muttering under her breath. The rest of us stood in silence, waiting for her to make sense of what she was seeing. But as she ran her fingers over the symbols, a strange sensation passed over me. A sense of being watched, of being listened to. I turned, my eyes scanning the jungle, but there was nothing visible, only the oppressive silence and the ever-present howls in the distance. Then, without warning, the ground trembled beneath our feet. It wasn't just a shake, it was a violent thrum, a deep, resonating pulse that came from beneath the earth itself. It rattled our bones and sent dust falling from the ruins above us. "What the hell was that?" Vale shouted, her hand on her weapon. Rook stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. Now!" But before I could respond, the air around us shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick fog began to roll in from the jungle, swirling around our legs. It was dense, almost unnatural in its speed, as if it was being forced in our direction. "Stay close," I barked. "We move now." We turned to head back toward the ship, but the fog was closing in too quickly. It was thick now, swirling around us like a living thing, obscuring our vision. We couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and the sense of being followed, of being hunted, grew stronger with every passing second. Then I heard it, a soft click. It was subtle, almost like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. I froze, turning to Rook. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her face pale. "We're not alone." Before we could react, something moved in the fog. It was fast, too fast for us to get a clear shot. A figure darted between the trees, its movements too fluid, too quick. Then there was another and another, their forms barely visible in the thick mist. They were closing in. I turned to the team. "We need to run." We bolted toward the ship, the fog thickening around us. But the figures in the mist were faster. They moved through the fog like it was nothing, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. The air was filled with a cacophony of sounds. The heavy thuds of something running, the crackling of branches being snapped underfoot, and then that same eerie whisper. "You shouldn't have come." It wasn't the same creature we'd seen earlier. This voice was different, lower, more guttural. It came from all around us, as if the jungle itself was speaking. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as we reached the edge of the clearing, the ship now visible through the fog. But it was too late. One of the figures lunged from the mist, its spindly hand grabbing hold of Vale's arm. She screamed, but before we could react, it pulled her into the fog, disappearing into the thickness of it. "Vale!" I shouted, running toward the sound of her voice. But the mist swallowed her up. She was gone. We were now outnumbered. We were surrounded. "Get to the ship!" I yelled to Rook, but she was already backing away, her eyes darting around in panic. Something was wrong. Something was wrong with this planet. These creatures weren't just hostile. They were organized, calculated, intelligent. It wasn't just the wildlife that had evolved unnaturally. The entire ecosystem had been shaped by a force far greater than anything we'd imagined. And that force was coming for us. The fog was choking. Thick and suffocating, it clung to everything like a wet blanket, distorting the world into an unrecognizable blur of shapes and shadows. My heart hammered in my chest as I sprinted toward the ship, my boots pounding the damp earth, the sound of my breath ragged in the heavy air. Vale was gone. She had been pulled into the mist without a trace. One moment she was there, shouting, fighting to break free, and the next she was just swallowed up by the fog. I could still hear her scream echoing in my mind. It rattled my soul. The others were close behind me, running as fast as they could, but the pursuit had already begun. We were being hunted. Rook was ahead, her face pale as she glanced over her shoulder every few seconds. She was faster than the rest of us, her legs longer, her stride determined, but I could see the panic in her eyes. We had no idea what was out there, and with Vale gone, the fear was palpable. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was desperation. As we neared the ship, I could feel the air shift again. A deep, resonating thrum vibrated through the ground beneath our feet, as though something large, something alive, was stirring below. The ground shook with a subtle tremor, the trees around us creaking and groaning in response. The jungle itself seemed to be alive, aware of our movements, anticipating our next step. "We need to move, Captain." Rook's voice cracked as she turned to look at me. Her eyes were wide with terror, her breath coming in short gasps. "This isn't right. We're being watched." I didn't need any more convincing. I pushed forward, urging the crew on. "Keep moving," I shouted. "We're almost there." The ship was close now, but it felt like the jungle was closing in around us, the mist creeping in like a living thing, sliding over the leaves and trees, swallowing up the world. The howls had grown louder again, closer. They weren't just distant cries anymore. They were now circling us, darting from shadow to shadow, too fast for us to track. I could feel their presence, like a looming cloud of death, hanging just over our heads. But we couldn't stop. The ship was within reach, and as I pushed through the dense fog, I saw the silhouette of the Prometheus looming ahead. I could see the faint lights of the entryway in the distance. We were almost safe. Almost. That's when I heard it. A snap. A loud crack of bone and wood that cut through the silence like a knife. I spun around, my breath freezing in my throat. Behind us, through the fog, I saw them. The figures. The same grotesque humanoids we'd seen earlier, now moving toward us with terrifying speed. Their long, gangly limbs were twisting in ways they shouldn't, their glowing yellow eyes fixated on us like a predator, locking onto its prey. I grabbed Rook's arm, pulling her toward the ship. "Go!" I barked. But as we neared the entryway, the ship's docking hatch suddenly slammed shut with a loud, echoing clang. My heart skipped a beat. The door was closed, and we hadn't opened it. It was as if the ship itself had sealed us out. "What the hell?" Rook shouted, pressing her palm against the door. "Why won't it open?" I cursed under my breath, hitting the comm on my wrist. "Vale, open the hatch! We're locked out! What the hell is going on?" There was nothing but static, no response. Only the harsh buzzing of interference. I turned back to the jungle, my blood running cold. The figures were closer now, so close that I could see their twisted, contorted features. their long arms hanging at unnatural angles, their mouths slightly agape, showing rows of sharp teeth, glistening in the foggy light. God help us. "We need to find another way in," I yelled, grabbing Rook's arm and pulling her toward the side of the ship. We ran, but the figures were almost upon us. The fog thickened, swirling violently now, as if the very air was conspiring against us. Every direction felt wrong, as though the jungle itself had become an enemy. And then, without warning, something moved in the fog. Something huge, something fast. I didn't see it coming. 1 second, we were running for cover, and the next, a massive shape leaped out of the mist, slamming into me with bone-crushing force. My breath was knocked out of my chest as I was sent crashing to the ground. My vision blurred, and the world spun. I gasped for air, but my lungs felt like they were filled with cement. The creature's face was disgusting. It wasn't the humanoid we had seen earlier, but something much bigger, more feral. Its skin was a patchwork of jagged, mottled patterns, like it had been stitched together from multiple animals. Its eyes were pure black, void-like, and as it hissed at me, I saw rows of teeth too many to count, each one sharp and jagged like broken glass. I struggled to get my bearings, my arms weak as I tried to push it off me. But the creature was too strong. It was pulling me toward its mouth, its hot, fetid breath against my skin. I felt its claws tearing into my suit, raking through the fabric, getting closer to my flesh. "Captain!" Rook screamed, her voice breaking. I turned to see her charging toward me, her weapon raised. She fired, and a blast of energy hit the creature square in the chest, knocking it back with a powerful jolt. But the creature didn't stay down. It screeched in fury, its body contorting unnaturally as it lurched to its feet, its black eyes locking onto Rook. It was relentless. Rook backed up, but she was no match for it. She tripped over a fallen branch, and the creature lunged at her. I pushed myself to my feet, but everything felt slow, like I was moving through molasses. My heart was racing, and my breath was coming in shallow gasps. There was nothing I could do but watch as the beast closed in on her. "Rook, no!" I screamed, but the words felt useless. The creature grabbed her by the arm, yanking her off the ground, and I could hear her scream as its claws dug deep into her skin. I reached for my weapon, aiming it at the beast, but before I could pull the trigger, the creature stopped. It froze mid-attack, its eyes narrowing as it looked over its shoulder, as if hearing something we couldn't. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature released Rook and retreated back into the fog. It disappeared into the mist like it had never been there, leaving us standing in stunned silence. I rushed to Rook's side, my hands trembling as I checked her wounds. She was bleeding, but it didn't seem to be life-threatening. The pain was written all over her face, but she was alive. "What the hell just happened?" I muttered, still scanning the jungle for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing. The mist had swallowed it whole. The jungle had fallen silent again. "I don't know," Rook said, her voice hoarse. "But that thing, it wasn't alone. It was waiting for something." I helped her to her feet, my own body trembling. "We need to get inside now. Whatever that was, it's not the worst of it. We're dealing with something far more dangerous than we realize." Rook nodded, though she looked just as lost as I felt. She leaned against me for support, and together we moved toward the ship's hatch once more. I tried the comm again, but it was still dead. The air around us was thick with tension. Every step we took into the fog only deepened the sense that we were on the edge of something far darker than we had ever imagined. The moment we reached the entryway, I slammed my fist against the hull. "Open it, now!" There was a pause, just a split second, before the door began to creak open. We rushed inside, the door sealing shut behind us with a final resounding thud. I collapsed against the wall, my heart still racing. We had made it inside, but I knew, deep in my gut, that the worst was still to come. The weight of the silence pressed down on us. We were alone, utterly, completely alone. I hadn't realized how terrifying that feeling could be until now. Trapped aboard the Prometheus, with no contact from the outside and no way to escape. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The fog, the creatures, the disturbing wreckage of our own crew. This wasn't some isolated incident. This was something deliberate. Dr. Kendall was hunched over a terminal, her hands flying across the keys. The glow of the screen cast a sickly pallor across her face, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Fear that was hard to ignore, impossible to shake. "We're still getting interference," she muttered almost to herself. "The comms are dead. The power grid is shot. It's like the entire ship is cut off from the outside world." "We're not going anywhere unless we fix it," I said, my voice sharp. The weight of leadership felt heavier than ever, the cold knot of dread growing in my chest. "Find a way to restore power. Now." Rook stepped forward, still clutching her bleeding arm. The gash wasn't life-threatening, but it was severe, and she'd been losing strength steadily. "Captain," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion, "there's something else we need to worry about. The ship's systems, it's like they've been tampered with. Someone's been inside. Not just in the control rooms, but everywhere. I found traces of tampering in the cargo hold and in the storage lockers. Someone or something has been systematically disabling things, cutting our connection to the outside." My stomach dropped. This wasn't an accident then. Someone wanted us stranded. "We've never faced anything like this before," Kendall added, her voice trembling. "This planet, this place, it's not natural. The ecosystem here is wrong. And I don't just mean the wildlife. I mean everything. The atmosphere, the gravitational pull, even the electromagnetic fields. It's all distorted, like someone designed it this way." I absorbed her words slowly, the weight of them pressing down on me. A manipulated world. Something or someone had designed this place, and we had walked right into its trap. "I think we need to get to the secondary control room," I said after a long pause. "We need to see if we can get any more answers." Rook glanced at me warily, then at the flickering lights around us. "We can't just sit here," she muttered. "We need to make a move, and fast." I nodded. "We'll stick together. Kendall, keep working on the power systems. Harrison, you're with me. Rook, stay back and rest." Rook shot me a look. "I'm fine to move. Just stay close." We moved quickly through the ship, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that something was watching us. The hallways felt colder now, as though the temperature had dropped significantly in the time it had taken us to reach the bridge. The low hum of the emergency lights was the only sound, cutting through the otherwise suffocating quiet. As we rounded a corner near the storage bay, a soft, echoing thud sent us all stiffening. It was low but distinct. Something was out there. Something large. Something powerful. "Stay alert," I whispered, signaling for everyone to move closer. My hand instinctively moved to my sidearm, though I knew it wouldn't do much against whatever was out there. We reached the secondary control room without further incident, but the sight inside made my stomach turn. The lights were completely dead in the room, and the only illumination came from the red emergency bulbs hanging overhead. The room looked like a war zone, chairs overturned, consoles cracked open as though someone had tried to pry them apart. And in the corner, something caught my eye. A mangled suit, its helmet torn open, the contents spilling out across the floor in a sickening heap. I felt my breath catch. It was Mitchell's suit, the one we had found earlier in the bridge. But now it was clear he hadn't just died from the creature's attack. He had been dissected. I stepped closer, unwilling to look away, even as my mind screamed for me to stop. There were signs of something dark, something deliberate. He had been opened, studied, like an insect pinned to a display. His limbs were twisted at impossible angles, his organs exposed, and there was no sign of life. "This isn't just a hunt," Kendall whispered. "This is an experiment. They're studying us." Rook didn't answer, her face pale and her gaze fixed on the body. Harrison's jaw was clenched so tightly I thought it might break. He was the first to speak, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "We need to get out of here. Now they're picking us off one by one." My heart was pounding, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. It was like the room itself was telling me something. Something I didn't want to know. Something important. "We need to make contact," I said, tearing my eyes from the horrific sight to focus on the mission at hand. "Kendall, we can't stay here. We need to find a way to send a signal. Now." Kendall nodded and began working at a nearby terminal, her fingers moving frantically over the keys. But before she could make any progress, another tremor shook the ship, harder this time, making the walls groan. The ship seemed to shudder under the weight of some unseen force. "What was that?" Rook gasped, her hands clutching the console for support. I moved toward the window of the control room and stared out. The fog outside had thickened, the air heavy with static. There was something moving in the distance, something big. A shadow shifting against the fog, a shape that seemed to grow larger as the seconds ticked by. "Is that a creature?" Harrison murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. "It's not just a creature," I said, dread pooling in my stomach. "Whatever's out there, it's not just hunting us, it's tracking us, and now it knows exactly where we are." The shape outside drew closer, its massive form becoming more defined. As it neared the ship, I could see the outline of thick, armored scales and long, barbed limbs that scraped the ground like knives. I didn't have time to think. I had to make a decision, and fast. We need to get back to the main bay. Lock the doors and hold our ground until we can figure this out. Kendall, start sending out that distress signal. We can't let them get any closer. As we turned to leave the control room, another violent jolt rocked Prometheus. The ship rattled and the lights flickered. But this time, the sound that followed wasn't just the low hum of the ship's systems. It was the unmistakable sound of scratching, heavy, scraping claws against metal. It was as if the creature outside were testing the hull, looking for a weak spot, waiting for its moment to strike. I motioned for the crew to hurry, my pulse racing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to wait. It was coming. We barely made it to the main hallway before the next tremor hit. The ship shuddered violently, a jarring pulse that felt like it was coming from beneath the surface. I grabbed hold of the nearest console to steady myself, heart pounding in my chest. Outside the window, the massive shadow grew closer, its grotesque shape cutting through the fog with terrifying precision. "Move!" I shouted, my voice more forceful than I intended. Kendall stumbled, her face flushed with panic as Harrison grabbed her arm to pull her toward the exit. Rook, though still pale from her earlier injuries, didn't hesitate. She was already ahead of us, her eyes wide with determination. If there was one thing I knew about her, it was that she never let fear take control, even if it was clear that we were in a fight for our lives. But the question now wasn't if we'd survive. It was how much longer we could hold out before the inevitable happened. The low hum of the Prometheus emergency lights had become a constant background noise. But beneath that, there was something else. A vibration in the ship's bones, a tremor of the metal, as though something was creeping closer. The clawing sound we'd heard earlier was unmistakable now. Something huge was trying to get in. "There's no time," Harrison muttered, his voice tight with urgency. "They're not going to wait for us to figure it out. They'll tear this ship apart to get to us." "I know," I said grimly. "We need to seal the doors and get to the escape pods. But before we do that, we have to send out the signal. We can't die here without someone knowing what happened to us." Kendall nodded but didn't speak. The fear in her eyes said more than any words could. I knew she was as terrified as the rest of us, but she was still fighting for control. We all were. We made it to the lower levels of the ship without any further interference, but every step felt like we were walking on eggshells. The scratching outside grew louder, closer, until it seemed like the creature was just on the other side of the hull. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the beast outside had a precise understanding of our movements, as if it could sense where we were, when we were moving and when we stopped. "Captain, you have to hurry," Rook said, her voice strained. "I can feel them coming. Whatever they are, they're smart. They know we're running out of time." We rounded a corner, and the corridor stretched out before us, eerily quiet despite the chaos outside. The escape pods were ahead, one of the few systems on the ship still working, thanks to its isolation from the rest of the compromised systems. The door to the pod bay slid open with a soft hiss, but the sight inside wasn't reassuring. Each pod was locked, its systems offline. We couldn't launch them without getting the power back online, and that was something we didn't have the luxury of doing. I turned to Kendall, who had already begun working on the backup console. She had her hands steady now, her eyes darting from one terminal to the next. The tension in the air was suffocating. "Do it," I said through gritted teeth. "We're out of options." You have to get the pods online now. Kendall nodded, fingers flying across the console, her face strained with concentration. The rest of us stood guard, watching the shadows outside, waiting for the inevitable attack. The tremor came again, this time with more force, rattling the ship's structure. The hull groaned in protest. I could feel the ship shifting, as if it were struggling to remain intact. The claws outside scraped harder against the walls, and suddenly I knew. They weren't just clawing at the ship. They were digging to get in, like creatures intent on feeding on whatever had wandered into their territory. "We're running out of time," Rook muttered, her voice barely audible. "I don't think we can make it. The creature's already here." It was hard to argue with her. The metal walls seemed to be vibrating in response to the growling sound of the thing outside, as if it were using some unseen force to tear into the ship itself. There was no longer any doubt in my mind. These creatures weren't simply predators. They were calculating, purposeful, and they had a plan. We were the prey in their experiment. Suddenly, Kendall looked up from the console, her face pale, her eyes wide. "I've got it! I've got the comms back online. I've set the signal to loop every 10 minutes. It's a distress signal, an SOS that the fleet will definitely pick up." "Thank God," Harrison breathed, relief washing over his face for the first time since we'd landed. But before we could even begin to celebrate, the ship groaned again, louder this time, and the lights flickered before dying completely. And then there was a sound. It wasn't the claws scraping against the metal anymore. It was something much worse. It was the sound of tearing. The hull of the Prometheus was being shredded from the outside. I bolted to the nearest panel, hitting the emergency seal button. The doors to the escape pods began to close slowly, but it was already too late. A massive force slammed against the side of the ship, buckling the walls with an enormous bang. The room plunged into darkness, and all we could hear was the hissing of air as it rushed out of the breach. "Move!" I shouted. We didn't have a choice anymore. The escape pods were our only hope, but with the ship being torn apart from the outside, it was doubtful they would hold up. I grabbed Kendall's arm and yanked her toward the nearest pod. Harrison followed, but Rook hesitated. "Rook!" I barked. "Now!" She didn't answer, but the panic in her eyes said enough. She had seen something outside, something that made the terror we'd already experienced look like nothing more than a warm-up. Whatever was coming, it was beyond anything we could have imagined. The escape pods were only a few steps away, but the Prometheus was groaning louder now, and the ship was beginning to tilt. It was a sinking ship, literally and figuratively. The escape pod's doors slammed open just as the ship tilted at a dangerous angle. I helped Kendall and Harrison into the pod first, then turned back for Rook. But before I could reach her, the ship's bulkhead buckled. The wall next to us collapsed inward, and a massive clawed limb, a grotesque, armored monstrosity, punched through the steel like it was tissue paper. I was thrown backward, crashing to the ground, and for a split second, I thought it was over. The creature's silhouette filled the opening, its glowing yellow eyes fixed directly on me. Its jagged, spiny body moved with terrifying speed, and I knew in that moment that it had been hunting us all along. But I wasn't about to die here, not without a fight. "Get in the pod, now!" I screamed at Rook, even as I scrambled to my feet. My gun was already drawn, but I knew it wouldn't help against something this massive. Without hesitation, Rook dove into the pod. I could see the terror in her face as she slammed the hatch shut behind her. Harrison had already started the engine, and the pod was beginning to lift off just as I heard the first sound of claws scraping against the pod's hull. The engines roared to life, and we were suddenly launched into the cold, empty expanse of space. But the battle was far from over. Through the small window of the pod, I saw Prometheus, our only hope for escape, ripped apart by the creature's monstrous assault. The ship didn't explode, didn't burn. It simply folded under the weight of something far beyond us. The creature, now fully aware of what we were capable of, turned its attention to us, and we were already outmatched. The escape pod rattled violently as we ascended, the ship's final groans echoing through the hull, and I couldn't shake the image of the creature's glowing yellow eyes. The pod's engines were firing at full capacity, but despite the violent shaking, we were still leaving the wreckage of the Prometheus behind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the creature to be there, chasing us, but there was nothing. Just the void of space, cold and empty. For a moment, the silence was almost calming. The only sound inside the pod was the rhythmic thrum of the engines and our collective breathing. But that peace was fleeting. The reality of what we had just escaped hit me like a freight train. "Are we clear?" Harrison's voice cut through the tension. His eyes were wide, the adrenaline still coursing through him. But there was a trace of something else. Something darker there. Fear. "We're not safe yet," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. My hands still shook from the close call, but my mind was sharp. The creature, it wasn't just attacking the ship. It knew we were on it. It was hunting us. Rook, who had been sitting in the corner of the pod, leaned forward. Her expression was one of disbelief, as though she couldn't fully process what had just happened. It was like it wanted us, as if it was tracking us the whole time. Why else would it tear through the ship like that? Kendall, who had been silent for most of the ordeal, finally spoke up, her voice thin but sharp. It wasn't just that. The planet, this world, was built for them. Whatever evolutionary path this place followed, it created a predator that knows exactly how to track, kill, and... She didn't finish her sentence, and none of us needed her to. We knew what she meant. This wasn't just a random attack. It wasn't even an isolated incident. This was part of something far larger, something we weren't equipped to understand. The pod's navigation system blinked to life, casting pale light against the dark interior. A soft, mechanical voice broke the tension. "Escape pod trajectory complete. Entering orbit around planet X743. That was the last thing we needed to hear." "Great," I muttered, leaning over to glance at the console. "We're in orbit around that hellhole." The planet, now visible through the tiny porthole, was as desolate as I remembered. A swirling mess of fog and storm clouds choked the atmosphere. We were in a perfect orbit above the wreckage of the Prometheus, which was now little more than floating debris, drifting slowly into the planet's gravitational pull. But that wasn't the worst part. From here, we could see the massive outline of the planet's surface. The dark expanse of jagged mountains, dense forests, and rivers of thick, viscous liquid. No sign of life, or at least, nothing we could recognize. It was a barren place, a planet that had evolved its own ecosystem, but had gone terribly, shockingly wrong. Kendall's voice came again, this time with an edge of frustration. "There's no way to make contact with the fleet. The comms are still down, and the signal's still being blocked by whatever is on this planet. It's almost like it's intentional." I finished her sentence. "Like they don't want anyone getting out of here." We all exchanged glances. Rook had her arms crossed, her eyes distant, while Harrison was still staring at the screen, his expression one of quiet disbelief. "Why would anyone do this?" Harrison muttered, his eyes wide. "Why would they trap us here like this?" I didn't have an answer. No one did. We were just pawns in a much larger, much darker game, one that we hadn't even begun to comprehend. The ship's artificial gravity started flickering, throwing us off balance as we struggled to stay upright. "Hold on, Reiner!" I ordered, trying to steady myself as the pod veered slightly off course. The warning lights flashed red as the system's power fluctuated. We had no way of knowing if the escape pod's shielding would hold up under the pressure. It wasn't exactly built for long-term space travel. But the worst part? We had no control. We were at the mercy of whatever force had dragged us here. The pod continued its steady orbit, slowly rotating in place. The hum of the engines, now the only sound in the confined space. The real weight of our situation hit me like a brick. "We can't stay here." Kendall spoke again, but this time it wasn't a question. "We need to find shelter on the planet's surface. If we stay up here, we'll be sitting ducks." "Agreed," I said, my eyes scanning the screens for any possible solution. "But there's still no guarantee that it's safe down there. For all we know, the surface is worse than the ship." "You saw the wreckage," Rook muttered darkly. "You saw what happened to Mitchell. Whatever's down there is capable of anything." Harrison gave me a sideways glance. "Do we have a choice, Captain?" I didn't answer immediately. Deep down, I knew there was no escaping it. The planet's pull, the massive creature that had attacked us, and the destroyed Prometheus. We couldn't stay in orbit forever. We had to go down. The escape pods were the only way. Fine, I said after a long pause, trying to project as much confidence as I could. We'll attempt a landing, but we're going to need to work together if we have any chance of surviving. Kendall immediately began tapping commands into the console, rerouting the pod systems to prepare for re-entry. But I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This planet, this world, wasn't just dangerous because of the creatures. It was dangerous because it had been built this way. Someone or something had designed it to be this way, and it wasn't just the creatures that were predators. We were the prey. The pod began its descent, and the engines roared in protest, the heat shields activating as we entered the thick atmosphere. I gripped the armrest tighter, feeling the familiar sensation of weightlessness slowly shifting to the oppressive force of gravity. It was happening. We were committed. The view outside the small window shifted as we broke through the clouds. Jagged mountains rose like sentinels beneath us, a barren landscape stretching for miles, covered in strange alien vegetation. The surface looked harsh, hostile, as though nature itself had been warped, twisted by forces beyond our comprehension. The ground was coming up fast, too fast. "We need to slow down," I shouted, grabbing the controls and trying to steady the descent. The pod systems were failing, every light flickering in protest, and the very air around us felt thick, suffocating. Whatever this planet had been designed to be, it wasn't just a new world, it was a prison. We crashed. The impact was brutal. The pod was thrown sideways, slamming into the jagged terrain with enough force to rattle every bone in my body. The world spun violently before everything went black. I woke to the sound of alarms blaring, the pod's emergency lights flashing red. My head was pounding, and the world was a blur as I struggled to unbuckle myself from the restraints. The others were slowly coming to, groaning and rubbing their heads as they tried to orient themselves. Harrison was the first to speak. "Is everyone okay?" His voice was rough and his eyes were unfocused as he looked around. "Yeah," Rook groaned, pulling herself upright, her face pale. "Just bruised." "We're alive at least," Kendall muttered, staring at the control panel. The screen was cracked, and the systems were failing faster now. "But we're on the surface, and I think something is already aware of us." I didn't have to ask how she knew. I could feel it too. That same sense of being watched, like we were no longer in control. Something on this planet, someone knew exactly where we were, and it was coming for us. The pod sat at an awkward angle, half buried in the blackened, rocky soil. Outside the small window, the landscape sprawled in every direction, a jagged, twisted version of Earth's surface. The air outside was thick with strange fog, clinging to the broken landscape like some living, breathing thing. And somewhere, not far off, the wind carried a deep, low growl. "Everyone stay sharp," I ordered, gripping the edge of my seat as the pod systems flickered one last time, shutting down completely. We have no way of knowing what's out there. The moment we step outside, we're not just survivors anymore. We're prey. Rook was the first to unbuckle, her face grim. "Prey to what exactly?" she asked, voice tight with frustration. "We can't keep running forever. We need a plan." I gave her a look, barely holding back the anger that was rising in me. She was right. We couldn't just keep reacting, but no plan felt good enough. Nothing could prepare us for what we'd seen. Kendall had already begun tapping at the dead controls, trying to see if there was any power left in the pod to relay a distress signal. Her fingers hovered above the console for a long moment before she sighed and leaned back, her shoulders sagging. "It's no use. The planet's interference is blocking all transmissions. We're cut off." "Then we need to move," I said, standing up, my voice hard with finality. "We don't have a choice." The sound of the growl came again, louder this time, a bone-deep reverberation that made the ground beneath us seem to shake. Kendall froze, her eyes darting toward the door. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I didn't answer her. I couldn't, because I knew what it was, and whatever it wasn't alone. With a deep breath, I reached for the hatch. The pod systems had automatically sealed it when we crashed, and I had to manually unlock it. My hands were slick with sweat as I worked. The growl came again, closer. I could feel it vibrating in the walls. The fear in the air was palpable now. We weren't just in danger from the creatures on this planet. We were walking straight into the middle of a nightmare we had no hope of escaping. Finally, the hatch clicked open, and I shoved it aside. Outside, the fog was thick, clinging to the wreckage like a disease. The air had a heavy, metallic scent, as if the very atmosphere of the planet was poison. As I stepped out, the first thing that hit me wasn't the cold. It was the silence. A silence so complete it made the growling noises from before seem like distant echoes. Everything here was muted, unnatural. The rest of the crew piled out behind me, Harrison bringing up the rear. We spread out, weapons drawn, eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement in the mist. "What now, Captain?" Harrison's voice cracked through the oppressive quiet. "We find shelter," I replied, my hand tightening on the gun I was holding. "We need to figure out what we're up against, but we can't do that if we're out in the open." We moved in silence, stepping carefully over the wreckage of the escape pod and making our way toward what appeared to be a set of strange, organic structures in the distance. At first glance, they seemed like twisted trees, their limbs contorted in grotesque shapes. But as we drew closer, it became clear they weren't trees at all. The growths were alive, some kind of sentient plant or organism, pulsating with a faint, eerie glow. "We're not alone," Rook muttered, her voice tinged with dread. "I don't like this." "I don't think we have a choice," I said, my voice low. "We need to get inside before whatever's out there finds us." But no sooner had I spoken than the growl sounded again, this time directly behind us. We all spun, hearts leaping into our throats. From the mist emerged a shape, a massive, hulking form, its eyes glowing bright yellow like two burning orbs. It was impossibly large, its body covered in thick armored plates that glistened with what looked like resin. A pair of massive claws scraped the ground as it advanced, its sharp, jagged teeth glinting in the light. "It's them." A dozen more shapes followed, creatures, each more grotesque than the last. Some of them were humanoid in form, but twisted, bent in unnatural angles, while others were crawling, dragging themselves along the ground with disturbing speed. They had no faces, no visible eyes, only dark slits for mouths, lined with jagged teeth. Their bodies were elongated and unnatural, as though evolution had crafted them into nightmare versions of predators. "Run!" I yelled, heart pounding as adrenaline shot through me. We turned and bolted, not knowing what else to do. The creatures gave chase instantly, their limbs moving in ways no natural predator could, skittering across the ground with terrifying speed. The mist parted before them, revealing their twisted forms in horrifying detail. "Faster!" I screamed, urging my team forward, but I could feel the air closing in around us, as if the planet itself was tightening its grip. There was no escape. The creatures were closing in too quickly, and then, as though the planet were mocking us, the ground beneath us shifted. We stumbled, trying to stay on our feet as the earth buckled and cracked, revealing a deep chasm below. A massive fissure split open the ground, as though the planet itself was rejecting us. I skidded to a stop, my heart racing. The others halted as well, but the creatures were still advancing. "We're trapped," Kendall said, her voice shaking. "There's no way out." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the chasm in front of us and the nightmarish shapes that were closing in. We were out of options. Then I remembered the emergency beacon on the escape pod, the one Kendall had activated earlier. Without thinking, I turned to face the others, my voice hoarse. "Get to the pod. We'll use the beacon as signal for help. We don't die here." The creatures were too close, and we didn't have time to argue. We ran for the escape pod, the ground shaking with every step we took. But as we neared the wreckage, the ground beneath us cracked once more, sending us tumbling into the dark abyss below. Everything went black. I woke in darkness. It was cold. I couldn't feel my limbs, but I could hear the others, faintly, groaning in pain. Slowly, I managed to push myself upright. A dim, unnatural light flickered above us. Too distant to be natural, but enough to give us some orientation. We were alive, but something else was down here with us. The growls, the snarls, the hissing sounds. They were everywhere. We weren't just on a planet, we were in a trap. And then I saw them. Hundreds of eyes glowing in the dark, watching us, silent, patient. The creatures were no longer chasing us. They had stopped, waiting, as if they were studying us. I swallowed, forcing myself to take slow, steady breaths. This isn't the end, I muttered under my breath. We can get out. But the truth hit me hard, and as the shadows closed in, we realized this was no accident. We were not just survivors in a deadly game. We were the final piece in a twisted evolutionary puzzle, and the planet itself wasn't just a predator. It was the creator of monsters like us.